Greetings to everyone. I'm here on behalf of President Joey Hill. Dr. Hill is at another engagement representing the seminary, and I'm standing in this part of it to say welcome on behalf of the faculty, staff, and all the members of the MTS family to the group who are online. And I'm standing from our registrar, about 70 of you are online, those that are here in person. We're grateful for your presence and we're looking forward to this lecture. I'll come back in a few minutes and do my other part, which is my part.
Good evening, everyone. For those who are online in the room, my name is Ferris Blunt. I'm an assistant professor of theology here at Memphis Theological Seminary. Let's go to God together in prayer. Oh God, how we thank you for this day and this opportunity to come together to learn and grow as a body. God, we thank you for our guest lecture and all he'll share as he connects the lives and legacies and work of men who chart a way forward for us as we consider how to live together as human beings. God, we pray that this lecture might be an enriching, enlightening space, oh God, one in which our eyes are opened, our ears are open, God, and our hearts are opened to what you're saying to us. God, we pray we might leave this space better than which we came, and more committed to doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with you. It's in your name we do offer this prayer with deep thanksgiving in our hearts. We say together, amen.
I'm Carmichael Crutchfield, the academic dean here at MTS, and on behalf of the faculty and staff of the Memphis Theological Seminary, we welcome to the 2026 William T. and Barbara Ingram lecture. I'm here, but my purpose now is to sort of introduce what this lecture is about. This lecture is funded by a family that is noted for their service to Jesus Christ in their lives and ministry. Established by the Reverend Dr. William T. Bill Ingram and his wife, Virginia, the Ingram lectures are made in honor of their parents, the Reverend and Mrs. W.T. Ingram Sr. and the Reverend and Mrs. J. Will Howell. Virginia Ingram served as many years as a librarian both in the Memphis public schools and at the University of Memphis. Her spirit of intellectual sharing, faith, and welcome for others was shared by her husband, Bill. Bill Ingram guided Memphis Theological Seminary in its move from McKenzie, Tennessee, to Memphis, Tennessee in 1964. Every time I read that and every time I hear that, and particularly in light of the days in which we're living today, it sort of really warms my heart to know that I serve a seminary that has this kind of legacy, this kind of history, that in 1964, where in most places African Americans were not welcome, this school started welcoming African Americans in 1964. And in 1960, becoming the first, and then to highlight this, becoming the first private institution of higher education in the city to have an integrated student body. Dr. Ingram was the first president of the seminary in Memphis. Along with other Cumberland Presbyterian visionaries, he saw the need for a seminary critically to engage with theological scholarship, deeply rooted in a life of faith and committed to the well being of people and the whole of God's creation. Our three key values: scholarship, piety, and justice. Tonight, continuing in the footsteps of Dr. and Mrs. Ingram, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Adam Clark, Associate Professor of Theology at Xavier University. Let us now engage as we hear the introduction that will come at this time.
Good evening. I am Tom Hermans Webster, affiliate faculty in Methodist and Wesleyan Studies here at Memphis Theological Seminary, and it is my distinct honor to introduce to you tonight's Ingram lecturer, Dr. Adam Clark. Dr. Clark is Associate Professor of Theology at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. He earned his PhD from Union Theological Seminary under the mentorship of Dr. James Halcone, and he integrates Black liberation theology, contemplative praxis, and justice work in his scholarship and teaching. Committed to the idea that theological education in the 21st century must function as a counter story, Dr. Clark equips students to read against the grain of the dominant culture by raising critical consciousness, unmasking conventional wisdoms, and reimagining the good. During his tenure at Xavier, Dr. Clark has received several distinctions in teaching, including Teacher of the Year nomination by the Alpha Sigma Nu International Honor Society and the Faculty Support Award by the Black Student Association. His courses on Black theology, justice and power, faith and justice, and religion and hip hop contribute to the university's Jesuit practice of educating students in the service of faith and the promotion of justice. He currently serves as the co-chair of the Black Theology Group at the American Academy of Religion, actively publishes in the area of Black theology and Black religion, and participates in social justice groups at Xavier and in the Cincinnati area. I could go on, but it's your turn to talk. Please welcome with me for the 2025 Ingram Lecture entitled Black Prophetic Faith and the Soul of Democracy, Dr. Adam Clark.
Good evening, everybody. It is an honor to stand before you this evening at Memphis Theological Seminary for the William T. and Virginia H. Ingram Lecture. I want to begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to Tom and to Ferris and to anyone else I may not be aware of who had something to do with this generous invitation and putting this event together. I've only recently come to learn about the legacy of the Ingrams, whose lives and leadership, marching with the sanitation workers, standing with the marginalized, and embodying the gospel in public life, helped shape the very identity of this seminary. That makes tonight's conversation not just an academic exercise, but a living continuation of the work that the Ingrams and so many others began to orientate theological study to the challenge of serving Christ in the church and in the world. Now, I can't remember the actual title of the lecture I submitted to Tom, but tonight I want to talk about Black prophetic faith in times of crisis. And I'm going to invite you to consider how the Black prophetic tradition can serve as an alternative public theology in an age marked by a rising Christian nationalism and contested visions of the gospel. My hope is that together we will not only honor the memory of those that came before us, but we will also discern how God is calling us here and now to embody a dangerous gospel, one that resists easy domestication and joins God's liberating work in the world. As many of you know, we are living through a moment of an acute theological crisis. Across the country, we see an intense resurgence of white Christian nationalism, claiming to speak for God and country. At the same time, the Black prophetic tradition, rooted in the faith of Africans who were brought to these shores and embodied in the witness of Martin Luther King Jr., continues to call the church back to justice, dignity, and the God of the oppressed. These two visions are colliding in the public square with a ferocity not seen in decades. The recent death of Charlie Kirk has become a flashpoint for this conflict. Now, all life has intrinsic value. I don't need to tell this community that. And all life is and the loss of life is tragic. But what has shocked so many of us is how quickly his death has been recast in theological language. In some circles, he's already being hailed as a Christian martyr. One congressman had the audacity to proclaim that Kirk would have been a 13th disciple, while Cardinal Dolan likened him to St. Paul. Social media posts place his image alongside Martin Luther King Jr., and now a bizarre canonization is underway, with calls for a national day of remembrance and even a statue on the National Mall, portraying him as an exemplary believer. Yet those of us formed in the Black church and its prophetic theological heritage cannot ignore what his public rhetoric represented. Kirk consistently demeaned and pathologized Black people and the civil rights movement. He called Martin Luther King Jr. an awful person. He dismissed the Civil Rights Act as a mistake. He derided George Floyd as a scumbag. He trafficked in racial tropes about Black Americans and Black pilots, and sneered at empathy itself as being damaging. And there's more and more and more. But these are not incidental slips. They are a sustained pattern that seeks to delegitimize the very movement and communities that produce Black prophetic witness. This is why his posthumous elevation into a martyred saint figure is not a neutral act of grief, but a theological event with public consequences. It reveals a crisis over the public meaning of Christian faith. Is Christian witness about protecting the privilege and baptizing hierarchy? Or is it about joining God's liberating work with and for the oppressed? It also raises urgent questions about the public function of Christian theology. Theology does not simply interpret doctrine. It also shapes moral imaginations about who counts as neighbor, who bears the image of God, and what justice requires. In this moment, our task as theologians is not to remain silent, but to name clearly what is at stake, to challenge false gospels, and to retrieve resources of Black prophetic faith, a faith rooted in God, in a God who hears the cries of the enslaved and sides with the crucified. In white Christian nationalism, if white Christian nationalism represents a distorted vision of Christian faith, one that equates the gospel with the preservation of privilege and power, then Black prophetic faith offers a counter vision. It's not simply Black religion as a sociological category, but a theological tradition forged in suffering, sustained in hope, and directed toward freedom. Black prophetic faith is rooted in Scripture's own stories about liberation. It reads Exodus not as an abstract metaphor, but as God's concrete action on the behalf of the enslaved. It hears Mary's Magnificat. God has brought down the powerful and lifted up the lowly, alongside Luke 4, where Jesus connects his anointing to the liberation of captives. It takes seriously Revelation's view that of a new heaven and new earth, and interprets that as a summons to reorder society. Above all, it insists that God is never neutral in the face of oppression, but takes sides with the marginalized and the crucified. This tradition also models a public function of theology different from the nationalist canonization of Charlie Kirk, where white Christian nationalism sanctifies hierarchy and demonizes pathology. Black prophetic faith centers empathy and compassion as a theological virtue, God's own solidarity with the suffering and hurting of this world. Where nationalism frames power and dominance as virtues, Black prophetic theology sees service, sacrifice, and mutuality as hallmarks of authentic discipleship. This is why the Black church and its theologians, such as James Cone, Katie Cannon, Howard Thurman, and Dolores Williams, and countless unnamed saints, have insisted that theology be done from below, in conversation with the oppressed, not just merely about them. It is a public theology because it speaks to public issues, confronts public sins, imagines public goods like freedom, equity, and reconciliation. While many see theologies from below as emergent from the social movements of the 60s, one of the earliest examples of a theology of below comes from Howard Thurman's text, Jesus and the Disinherited, written in the 1930s, right here. Now, Howard Thurman was he led the first African American delegation to meet Mahatma Gandhi, and he was thrilled to do it. He almost turned down the trip because he didn't want to be associated, like this is 1930s, right? At the height of Jim Crow South. And he didn't want to pretend like he was representing that. So after a struggle, he decided to go because he didn't want to turn down the opportunity. But I want to read a pivotal passage that made him rethink the dominant version of faith and reflect on the meaning and significance of Jesus Christ. Right. And this is chapter 1 in Jesus Disinherited. And he talks a bit about an experience he had while he was in India. I'll start. This is Thurman. In the fall of 1935, I was serving as a chairman of a delegation on a pilgrimage of friendship from the students of America to the students of India Burma, which is now Myanmar, and Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. It was at a meeting in Ceylon where the whole crucial issue was pointed out to me in a way I can never forget. At the close of a talk before a law college at the University of Colombo on civil disabilities under states' rights, that's just talking about kind of segregation, I was invited to the principal's office to have coffee. We drank our coffee in silence. After the service had been removed, he said to me, "What are you doing over here? I know what the newspapers say about your pilgrimage and all the rest, but that's not my question. What are you doing over here?" And then he says, "This is what I mean. More than 300 years ago, your forefathers were taken from the west coast of Africa as slaves. The people who dealt in the traffic of slaves were Christians. One of the most famous Christian hymn writers, Sir John Newton, made his money from the sale of slaves to the New World. He is the one who wrote, 'How sweet the name of Jesus sounds, and Amazing Grace,' the name of one of the most famous British slave vessels was Jesus. The men who bought the slaves were Christian ministers. Quoting the Apostle Paul, gave the sanction of religion to the system of slavery. Some 70 years or more ago, you were freed by a man who was not a professing Christian, talk about Lincoln, but was rather the spearhead of political, social, and economic forces, the significance of which he himself did not understand. During all this period, since you have lived in a Christian nation in which you were segregated, lynched, and burned, even in the church, I understand there is segregation. One of my students who went to your country sent me a clipping telling me about a Christian church in which the regular Sunday worship was interrupted so that many could join a lynch mob against one of your fellows. When he had been caught and done to death, they came back to resume the worship of their Christian God. Then he looks at Thurman, he says, "I am a Hindu. I do not understand. You are here in my country, standing deep within the Christian faith and tradition. I don't wish to be rude to you, but sir, I think you are a traitor to all the darker peoples of the earth. And I'm wondering what you, an intelligent man, can say in defense of your position." And there was an awkward silence. And Thurman kind of took it in, and he said they talked for 4 hours after that. And he had to wrestle with what about the Christian faith has claim on me, what holds me. And finally he came up with this distinction. He said, there's a distinction between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus. Okay? Said the religion about Jesus is the slaveholders' religion, is the segregationist religion, is the colonialist religion. The religion of Jesus is experiencing God the way Jesus experienced God. That's what I hold to. And he went on and developed this book called Jesus and the Disinherited, right? Where he's really saying that Christianity, even though it's been used as an instrument of the powerful, its original message was liberation of the disinherited. Jesus was a person was for peoples whose backs are against the wall. Even on the first page of this, I don't really read this too often, but I'll do it for you guys. That he says, um, he says, many and varied are the interpretations dealing with the teachings and life of Jesus of Nazareth. But few of these interpretations deal with what the teachings and life of Jesus have to say to those who stand with their backs against the wall. So that was an interpretive thing that he's actually interpreted. He goes on and talks about how Jesus was born in a climate of conflict. He was born into an imperial situation, right? And they have rough parallels to the way African Americans were living life under Southern segregation. He said there's a great similarity between the life conditions of Jesus as a colonized Jew, right, from Galilee, not from Jerusalem, and how Negro Americans were living during that time. And that was his point, really trying to do that. Now, that distinction between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus was used by some Black theologians. There's a theologian named Albert Cleage, one of the earliest Black theologians, right, who reread the idea of the religion of Jesus, the religion about Jesus, through the cultural lens of the Black Power movement. He says not only is Jesus Black, one of the earliest ones to do that after World War II, he said Jesus was the Black Messiah. He said Cleage saw the gospel differently from Thurman from below. He said Thurman primarily was saying that Jesus helps us struggles against what he called the hounds of hell. And the hounds of hell were fear, deception, and hatred. That's what caught up the oppressed. But with Cleage, he saw a different Messiah. He thought that Jesus was the Messiah who delivered from bondage. He didn't call it Black Christ. He called it the Black Messiah. Messiah is the Jewish term, right? Christ is the Greek term. So he preferred the Jewish idea of deliverer. And he imaged this Jesus as this he said Jesus was a Black revolutionary fighting against white Roman Empire. In the same way that Black revolutionaries in the 60s are fighting against white empire in the United States. See, he says a model for that. There's much more to be said, but I'm going to move on for that. The most comprehensive and systematic articulation of this alternative theology came from James Cone, though. In Black Theology of Black Power and a Black Theology of Liberation, Cone argued that any theology not identified with liberation of the oppressed is not Christian at all. He said you could do theology, but it's not Christian theology. You could do religious thought, but it's not Christian. For him, the very identity of Christianity was standing with broken and hurting people. If you do not do that, then you're not filling out Christian identity. You might be religious, but you ain't Christian, right? So that's Cone. He develops his all across the lynching theory. It's all talking about the same thing. How do you identify that, right? Now, as most of you probably already know, that Memphis itself holds significance in the place of the Black kind of prophetic tradition and imagination. Earlier today, I was half joking with Ferris. I said, I don't know if Memphis is more known for Martin Luther King or Glorilla, right? For civil rights, or Yo Gotti. For the Lorraine Motel, or Young Dolph, right? So I know in the movie Sinners, they had a blues character named Delta Slim. So I know there must be some Memphis Slims around here or something like that, right? But within the Black prophetic tradition, Memphis is more than a backdrop to martyrdom. It stands as a landmark of Christian solidarity with the struggles of the oppressed, a living parable of what the Black prophetic faith looks like in public. On February 1st, 1968, a huge terrestrial rainstorm hit Memphis, Tennessee. Sanitation crews, which were all Black at the time, had to rush for cover. Since they weren't allowed in white hotels, they were assigned colored cabins but the cabins were so small and dilapidated, 2 members of the crew couldn't fit in. Sleeping outside was not an option. The storm was too bad. Going to a hotel was not an option. Negroes weren't allowed in white hotels. So they climbed into their garbage trucks and slept in the garbage. During the night, the garbage truck malfunctioned, and 2 men, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death. No one seemed to care that Black men were treated like garbage. Outraged, Black sanitation workers called for a strike, but it failed because neither the religious community, the middle class, or the national labor movement seemed to support it. Black men were being treated like garbage, and no one seemed to care. About a month later, James Lawson contacted Martin Luther King Jr. to come to Memphis to get attention for the plight of sanitation workers. King, against strong objections from a lot of his inner circle, pulled himself away from planning the Poor People's Campaign, which was in disarray, to be in solidarity with garbage workers. A week later, King was struck down by an assassin's bullet. Now, many people, and I usually talk about this to people who are outside of Memphis, have seen the old pictures of Black men with those iconic placards over their neck and torso reading, "I am a man." But the full meaning of that message was, I am a man, not a piece of garbage. I am a man, not a piece of garbage. The image of a radical king in Memphis is very different from the king that's nationally celebrated. The image of the king that dominates our civic celebrations has been deeply sanitized. Cornel West calls it the Santa Clausification of king. A wise man with toys in his bag, smiling and handing out cookies to Black and white children. Or even the magnification of king, where king's life is inverted to be against DEI and critical race theory, or any government remedy that addresses racial injustice. This tames his legacy, robbing it of its bite and prophetic fire. If all King did was have a dream and talk about Black and white children holding hands together, why was he so despised? Why did the FBI label him the most dangerous Negro in America? They bugged his phone, they bugged his bedroom, they urged him to commit suicide. Dreaming alone does not produce that type of response. King represented the counter story of Black Christian faith. So we must always recognize there's at least 2 versions of king. There's a safe king and there's a dangerous king. The safe king is the kind of earlier king, the love your enemies king, the king who encouraged Southern Blacks to be nonviolent despite white terrorism and brutality. The king who advocated beloved community and wanted people not to be judged by the content, wanted people to be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That was King's emphasis until 1963. But he lived until 1968. And most people know very little about King after 1963. The late King, 1963 to 1968, you don't hear a lot about. That's the dangerous or radical King. King was deeply disappointed in America and her rate of progress. We don't remember that after 1963, King said his dream had turned into a nightmare. In the later part of King's life, there was a paradigm shift, a radicalization, where, and this is the aspect of King that we should lift up for today to kind of shake our collective amnesia. It's the King who said, America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. It's the King who said, America is on the wrong side of history. and that most whites are unconscious racists. That's the radical king. And they don't want you to hear too much about it because it's too explosive. Race has always been an explosive flashpoint in American life. And Christian nationalists know this. That's why there's so much energy poured into suppressing race from our national consciousness. The very language of justice has been twisted. The term woke, which originated in the Black community, has been demonized and weaponized against all race conscious remedies or policies. Even the teaching of slavery and its history has been branded as woke, divisive, anti American. We even see books like Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, or W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstructed, banned. Museum exhibits altered or removed. Initiatives that study race defunded. But yet, Confederate statues and names come back with a ferocious intensity. All of this is a part of an organized effort to erase the memory of racial injustice and blunt the work of racial reckoning. Many of these voices even invoke King's legacy to justify their actions, especially by appealing to the I Have a Dream speech. That speech was a watershed moment in America's conversation about race. But conservatives and progressives draw very different lessons from that moral vision. For conservatives, it's the end part of the speech. Content of character, not color of skin, is the most important aspect. For conservatives, color blindness is the dominant ethos of the speech. There should be no race consciousness in the law, they assert. Any use of race by the government or outreach by corporations is not an act of balance, but of preference. This conservative readings of the dream speech, or some variation of it, is the dominant ethos of America's public conscience of race. It interprets the civil rights movement as a movement to replace race consciousness with race neutrality. But the content of character remark and the I Have a Dream refrain is the last part of the speech, the flowery part. Most folks don't remember the first part. King was in front of the Lincoln Memorial and said, 100 years ago today, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a beacon of hope to millions of enslaved Africans. And then he said, 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. Blacks were crippled by segregation, lived on islands of poverty, and chained by discrimination. And in light of American promise, instead of sweeping it under the rug, this ought to be a national shame. Then he spoke of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as being promissory notes. However, the Negro has been issued a bad check marked insufficient funds. That is the framing of his speech that should be understood. As a matter of fact, what we refer to as the dream speech could be understood as the broken promises speech. King conceived of the civil rights struggle as a way of collecting on promises already made and admonished America to fix the problem she already created. The argument was not for legal uniformity, one size fits all, but for legal equality. Race, gender are factors in how justice is executed. He never intended to eliminate race or difference. He just didn't want people to be penalized or stigmatized being different. King naively thought that racism would fade away after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it persists. and his radical legacy can serve as a resource for how we address it. In King's early ministry, love was a dominant theme. But at the end of his life, he had shifted from love to hope. Hope was a dominant theme. For King, America's history need not be her destiny. History is not fated, and the contradictions of life are not final. Humans have the power to create history and can inject new meanings into the veins of civilization. So for King, the creation of a new society is not some type of fixed idea, but a very organic one. Societies are either growing or dying and decaying. So the idea is not just to preserve democracy, it's to grow democracy. Right? On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, King retreated into his room at the Lorraine Hotel. He was thinking about the sanitation strike. He was thinking how human beings should not be treated like garbage while he worked on his Sunday sermon. His title, Why America May Go to Hell. May. He drew from the Luke parable about Dives and Lazarus. It's not wealth that puts you in hell, but ignoring the humanity of the poor. King was assassinated before he ever delivered that sermon. But if we look at the condition of the poor today, if that's the criteria, we might be able to join King and say America still may go to hell. But if America does go to hell, it's her choice. And it's quite possible she may be so wedded to a death instinct that locks her into patterns of division and self destruction where human beings are permanently treated like garbage. But King calls us to be morally courageous, to be creatively maladjusted to patterns of destruction and despair. This entails undergoing a radical revolution of values. He writes, on the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life roadside. But that, according to King, is only the initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journeys on life's highway. We must do more than fling coins at beggars. We must come to see that the edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. King pushes us to face the fact that our hope for a better tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. And there is such a thing as being too late, King reminds us. Procrastination is a thief of time. And life is full of lost opportunities. This, according to King, may be our last chance to choose between chaos or community. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, fire next time. Thank you.
You'll stay there. When I open up for an opportunity for questions, we also will have questions coming hopefully from folks on the Zoom. So if you, Claire, could just let us know when those come in. So want to give everyone a chance to breathe and think. And then when you have an opportunity, raise your hand and we can begin the question.
Sure. Yeah. You're welcome.
I have one that might get us going.
Sure.
Could you speak a little to the relationship between King and Thurman that happens during King's doctoral work at Boston University, where Thurman is the chaplain
Yeah.
dean of the chapel at Boston University while King's working on his doctoral work.
Yeah, sure. Well, for some background, they both are Morehouse men. And Thurman, I think, went to Morehouse with King's father, Daddy King. So they had some type of association and familiarity, and they um, connected. I mean, there's what do you call it? Some people make the case that he carried Jesus' disinherited in his briefcase around. We don't know if that's like apocryphal. That's actual. That's actual historical fact, but it's a nice story. Uh, they had a respectful association. I don't know if they were like personally close, but he certainly admired Howard Thurman and saw him as an authoritative. And I think also it's worth to say most people don't talk about this part. When King got stabbed in Harlem by a black woman who was mentally ill, he came very close to death. He comes out with that sermon. If I would have sneezed, have you heard about that? But anyway, Thurman came to visit him in his hotel room. I mean, his hospital bed. Excuse me. And I think it really helped Thurman help King refocus on the why what he was doing. He got so caught up in just being busy and so many demands. I mean, King gave like over, I think it was like over 380 sermons or talks a year, like more than one a day, basically. So he just was in a spiral of just trying to respond to the demands of the time. And I think what Thurman was able to do is to get him to slow down and really focus on his why. Why am I doing all this? What's underneath all the activity? And Thurman is known as a pastor's pastor, right? Your favorite pastor is pastor, favorite pastor, right? He wasn't like someone who was out front. And some people criticize him for not being an activist church, but he saw the church as more like a lemonade stand where the activists could come and get refreshed. But he didn't want to join the movement because he thought that the tensions within the church could kind of stain the experience of worship that he was trying to put forward. Yeah.
I have a question, but I really want to let students if they want to. So, Clark, I'm missing my New Testament.
Okay, great. Yeah.
I've been immersed in teaching Romans this semester.
Mhm.
And today I had class this afternoon and spent we did chapters 5, 6, and 7, and Paul talking about being in bondage to sin.
Mm-hmm.
For Paul, sin was not so much personal moral failure. It was great malevolent force
Mm-hmm.
that has us in bondage. And the way the bondage looks is things like hierarchy, which creates competitiveness and us being adversaries, and fear and hatred and all of that. So I've been living there,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a professor. So now I'm new. And I'm finding myself really thinking about how and why that bondage seems so freaking attractive.
Wow. Yeah.
In many ways, America's history is a history of the ruling classes being in bondage like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And offered opportunities to keep that bondage.
Yeah.
And refusing to do so.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's a question in there somewhere. But I'm real struck listening to you talk about this. Maybe the question, your sense of why and how that bondage itself just seems so attractive to people who operate with it.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying is what Black theologians talk about as the religion of whiteness.
Yeah.
That it becomes like a bondage where it becomes this force that's not identified with skin color per se, but becomes this type of claim of on human identities of people who have European descent, where they're unable to see full humanity beyond that, right? Like it's kind of a it becomes an eye disease, right? Like that's what Abraham Joshua Heschel called racism an eye disease. He called it Satanism. And we have this eye disease, and um, W. Du Bois first termed the idea of a religion of whiteness, and Cohen kind of talks about the difference between Christianity and white religion. He calls it white religion, but he wants to say this is something different. Like if you could actually, you know, I'll take his last work. He says, why is it that white American Christianity has at the center of its faith a savior that was beaten and crucified unjustly, but they never paused and reflected on black bodies being lynched, right? Beaten and lynched unjustly. Why does that not occur to somebody that if that's at the center of your faith, that's not the same thing, right? And he says, because whiteness obstructs you from seeing the humanity of the other, right? It devolves your capacity. So he says it's not like it's not fated, but it's more like the camel through the eye of the needle kind of thing. Like it's really hard to move because it's so seductive. It is so tempting. So it's really identity claim. You can see this with white Christian nationalists today. That's why I used the Charlie Kirk example, how they could actually see that. They could, and if you bring up the comments that are disconfirming of their claims, instead of a introspective or a repentant, they get angry and they respond with violence, right? And even the idea of saying, well, how can you actually say someone's Christian who doesn't really believe in compassion or empathy for others, right? Even Trump, when he said, like, I've never asked for forgiveness. Like these are such core, yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's such a thing. It's such a profoundly that the inability to see that and to attack others that do see that, right? We call it like racial gaslighting, right? You're actually trying to talk about what other people do, what you're doing yourself, right? Like that kind of thing. So I think that's an attempt to really, if you look at the works of people, they're trying to understand like how whiteness is a social construct and it forms. It is not like a biological characteristic, and it becomes this kind of social force that operates in society unmarked. That's why it's important, like in Black theology, to mark whiteness as a constructed identity and a social force instead of it being seen as neutral and every other identity being marked. It's identity among identities.
Paul's language of bondage.
Yeah.
Bondage is not neutral.
Right.
Nobody
Yeah.
wants to be bondage.
Yeah.
You are.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have a couple questions from the chat
Okay, great.
that I want to bring in. A rather proud moment for the Methodist House of Studies. They're all coming from members of the Methodist House. Oh, really? Yeah, good work, y'all. One question from Arthur Washington. What do you think the effect of King going ultimately to death, that his death and the martyrdom there, what is that effect on our choice for a radical position of King, participation in the radical King today instead of the safe King?
Yeah. I think it's not so much with King, it's the interpretive lens in which King is done. Like King, what's happened, there's been so much ideological hijacking, just like with Jesus. Like, do you think, like, think about it. Do you, when you hear like a Charlie Kirk or people of that ilk, like, talk about their Christianity, their religion, they would, it's a good way of saying this, they are completely not aware they are worshiping a non-white deity. Like they talk like Jesus is white, right? But you say, well, why do you do that? And how does that relate to your immigration stance? Right? Like all this type of thing. So that's what I mean. Like um, most, I think a lot of biblical, I don't know most, a lot of biblical scholars will tell you the interpretation trumps, to use the word, the text in the Bible. What people interpret the Bible, what the Bible actually says, right, are two very different things. So we're talking about interpretive schemes. So I would say the same thing about King. It's the interpretive framing of him. It's not what he actually did. And I think in order to get to the radical king, we have to actually publicly memorialize or have more publicly artifacts of the radicality, such as that he wanted universal unemployment, such as that what was his stance on race? It wasn't like a colorblind idea, and his opposition to military. Like we Trump just from Department of Defense, Department of War. King talked about we need to have a Department of Peace, right? He advocated that we have like conflict resolution centers go throughout the world so that it doesn't even get to a point where we're actually killing each other. That's a thing, right? That's a thing. But I think that would be a way, but you don't hear that conversation raised up as a Christian position. It's just like when you hear like people talk about putting the Ten Commandments in the courtroom, they never talk about putting the Sermon on the Mount in the courtroom, right? You've never heard a judge say, "Let's the Sermon on the Mount." This Jesus, like, no, put the Ten Commandments. But it becomes, yeah. So that's what I would say. It's kind of also when people will talk about literal interpretations when the Bible talks about sexuality, but they won't talk about literal interpretations when they talk about rich people, right? They're not literal. They'll say, well, why is talk about the rich person to get the candle out of the needle? Well, no, that's not what it really says, right? They'll give you little Leviticus on sexuality and all that kind of stuff, right? So I'm just saying, like, it's just the way people like interpret scripture. It's not accountable. It becomes they don't realize they're coming from a framework. And I think you have to show them that you are picking and choosing what you see as authoritative in that text. The text doesn't speak for itself. No text speaks for itself. I mean, that's why we have interpretive things. In the Jewish church, it does better because it at least has a midrash. What I tell my students that the Constitution and the Bible are the two most where hermeneutics or interpretations are been the most important in Western civilization. So we're using interpretations of how people have looked at it more though so in the text. Matter of fact, most people think what they claim is in the Declaration of Independence is actually in the Constitution, and they don't know the difference between the two. I'm sorry, you seem like you wanted another thing.
Well, I could listen to you talk forever, which is why I'm going to ask you another question.
Yeah.
In your view of the Black prophetic faith today,
Mhm.
where should our urgency be aimed? Where should our hope drive us? What's the most urgent current crisis? And if we could play a crisis along this.
Yeah, I think the most urgent crisis is the demonization of those who are in solidarity with the poor, right? Which the president calls the left, right? But you ask him, what is the left? Like he never really it's like the left that exists in his mind is not the actual left on the ground. Right. Because the left has traditionally been labor unions, the academy, and the mainline churches, right? Like that was the kind of thing. But when he talks about the left, he's talking about like Antifa, which is really not a group, right? Like, what is this thing that he talks about the left that's so dangerous and destructive to America? Like, I don't know people who do that, right? So I'm saying, like, in terms of like the counter narrative has to give an account for where this country is in a persuasive way and where this country should be. And I don't see a national figure that's doing that effectively. Right. And I think that's why without and with and kind of the public abhors like a void. So because you don't have good information, you get bad stuff out there. And then people just latch on to that. And I think the Black prophetic tradition could do something by putting narrative out there that could help explain where we are and give a better account of it. Yeah.
I'm going to give time one more question in the house before we call it.
So what is the response of should the church give in times like these or in this current day and age with nationalism? What should be our response practically?
Yeah, I think practically the best way, there's two things. Probably practically the best counter is to ask the question, who is Jesus? Right? You say you serve in Jesus, but what is the Christ that you serve? That's one. And the connected one is to really clear out what is the love work of the church? Right? Is the love work of the church is to kind of baptize this hierarchy and to connect with a political party? Or is the love like what Augustine talked about? He says he calls sin disordered love, right? That our loves are disordered and that to be redeemed is to have rightly ordered loves. Like everybody loves, but your loves has to be ordered where God is central, Christ is central, right? So it becomes, and the way Cohn used to talk about it, that's why his Christology was the most developed part of his systematic thought, because he wants to challenge the American church on the Christ they claim to serve, right? And other things said we need to re-image Christ because the image of Christ that you have doesn't even look like the solidarity. First, is historically inaccurate, and also it shapes Christian behavior in a way that's contrary to the love work you claim to do. Right? So I think that's something that the church could actually be effective at a local level of doing, is really stating in very clear terms who is the Christ you serve, and the church, and what liberation theology said, the Christ is a liberator, so then the church must be a servant of a liberating Christ. And what that looks like in your locality may differ, right? Because every church is called to a different type of ministry. But whatever that ministry is should liberate in history around them. I thank you.
Want to thank you all for coming on behalf of the Community Engagement Committee. Keep an eye out for future lectures throughout the school year, both here at the seminary and online. And we look forward to seeing you there. Go in peace.